In 1846, a group of families set out for California in search of a better life. However, their journey took a tragic turn as they encountered brutal weather conditions, dwindling supplies, and unimaginable hardships along the way. Forced to resort to extreme measures for survival, including cannibalism, the Donner Party's ordeal became a symbol of resilience and desperation in the face of adversity. Despite the grim circumstances, this wild Western tale has captivated generations, serving as both a cautionary tale and a reminder of the enduring human will to survive, no matter what. Join us as we explore the untold details and the lasting legacy of this unforgettable chapter in American frontier history. This is the real story of the Donner Party. In the 1840s, many people from the eastern United States decided to move to the Oregon Territory or California. These places were hard to reach, requiring either a very long boat trip or a tough journey across the American wilderness. Some, like Patrick Breen, wanted to live in a place where everyone shared their Catholic beliefs. Others were drawn by the chance to make money out west, or by the idea that it was their destiny as Americans to settle the land between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Most people traveled in groups, known as wagon trains, starting in Independence, Missouri. They traveled about 15 miles a day, taking 4 to 6 months to reach their destination. The route followed rivers to a pass in the Rocky Mountains called South Pass, which was easier for wagons to cross. After that, they had different ways to go. One man named Lansford Hastings wrote a book called The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California to help people go west. He suggested a faster way through the Great Basin, even though it was longer. He hadn't even tried this route himself until in 1846, when he went from California to Fort Bridger in Wyoming. He stayed at the fort to convince others to take his shortcut. One of the hardest parts of the journey was the last 100 miles across the Sierra Nevada mountains. These mountains have many peaks over 12,000 feet high, and they get a lot of snow. The eastern side of the mountains is very steep. Timing was crucial for travelers to avoid getting stuck in mud or snowdrifts. They also needed to make sure that there was enough grass for their animals to eat. George Donner, originally from North Carolina, moved gradually westward to Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois, with a short stay in Texas. By early 1846, he was around 60 years old and lived near Springfield, Illinois. His family included his 44-year-old wife Tamsin, their 3 daughters Frances, Georgia, and Eliza, as well as George's daughters from a previous marriage, Elitha and Leanna. George's younger brother, Jacob, aged 56, also joined the group with his wife Elizabeth, stepsons Solomon and William Hook, and 5 children: George, Mary, Isaac, Louis, and Samuel. They were accompanied by Teamsters Hiram O. Miller, Samuel Shoemaker, Noah James, Charles Berger, John Denton, and Augustus Spitzer. James F. Reed, who migrated from Ireland to Illinois during childhood, was 45 years old at the time. His family included his wife Margaret, stepdaughter Virginia, daughter Martha Jane, or Patty as she was better known, sons James and Thomas, and Margaret's mother, Sarah Keyes, who was very ill with tuberculosis. Reed hoped California's climate would benefit Margaret's health, who was perpetually ill herself. The Reeds hired 3 men to drive the ox teams: Milford Milt Elliott, James Smith, and Walter Heron. Bayless Williams also joined as a handyman, with his sister Eliza serving as the family's cook. Although both the Reeds and the Donners were known in their community, it's uncertain how well they knew each other. Virginia Reed later mentioned that she had never met the Donner children before their journey. The elders of the Reed and Donner clan didn't share much in common regarding age, background, occupation, or personality. Their decision to travel together might have been due to convenience rather than a deep friendship. Interestingly, neither the Donners nor the Reeds mentioned each other in their letters home. In total, there were 34 people at the start of the journey. Each family had 3 covered wagons, and they hired teamsters to drive the oxen that pulled them, along with some other helpers. Their first destination was Independence, where the Oregon Trail started. The distance from Springfield to Independence was about 250 miles, or 400 kilometers. They planned to begin their journey after the spring rains had stopped and there was enough grass for their animals to eat. They wanted to arrive before snowfall blocked the Sierra Nevada mountains. On April 15th, 1846, the slow descent towards hell on Earth unfolded from Springfield, Illinois. In May 1846, 9 covered wagons started the plodding trek from Springfield, Illinois, heading towards Independence, Missouri. On May 10th, the Donner and Reed families reached Independence, where they spent 2 days getting ready for their trip. They bought extra supplies here for their long journey to California, and on May 12th, they set off from Independence. About a week after their second departure, on May 19th, the Reeds and Donners joined a group of 50 wagons at Indian Creek, roughly 100 miles west of Independence. This group was led by Colonel William Henry Russell. On May 27th, the Russell train was stopped by high water at the east bank of the Big Blue River in what is now Kansas. The travelers built a raft to ferry their wagons across. On May 29th, while the group was camped, Mrs. Reed's mother, Sarah Keyes, passed away due to the advanced tuberculosis. She was buried nearby, with a memorial rock marking her grave. On May 31st, the last of the wagons were ferried across the river. During the delay at the Big Blue River, the Murphy family from Tennessee joined the wagon train. Lavina Murphy, a widow, led her family of 13, including her youngest 5 children: John Landrum, Miriam Mary, Lemuel, William, and Simon. Lavina's 2 married daughters and their families also joined: Sarah Murphy Foster, her husband William M., and son Jeremiah George, and Harriet Murphy Pike, her husband William M., and their daughters Naomi and Catherine. Other families joined the wagon train along the way. William H. Eddy, a carriage maker from Illinois, brought his wife Eleanor and their 2 children, James and Margaret. The Breen family, led by Patrick, a farmer from Iowa, included his wife Margaret Peggy and 7 children. Patrick Nolan, a bachelor, traveled with them. German immigrant Louis Kessberg, along with his wife Elizabeth Philippine and daughter Ada, also joined. Their son Louis Jr. was born on the trail. 2 single men named Spitzer and Reinhardt traveled with another German couple, the Wolfingers, who were rumored to be wealthy. They also had a hired driver, Dutch Charlie Berger. An older man named Hardcoop rode with them too. By June 16th, the group had covered 450 miles of their journey, with another 200 miles left to reach Fort Laramie. They faced delays due to rain and a rising river, but Tamsen Donner wrote that they were currently at the Platte River, about 200 miles away from Fort Laramie in present-day Wyoming. She mentioned to a friend in Springfield that the journey had been smoother than expected so far, saying, "If things don't get worse than they have been, I'll say the hardest part is behind us." Young Virginia Reed remembered years later that she felt perfectly happy during the early part of the trip. On June 18th, Colonel William Russell stepped down as the leader of the wagon train because he, along with Edwin Bryant and others, decided to swap their wagons and oxen for mules to speed up their journey. They headed to Fort Laramie to make this exchange. On June 27th, the group the Donners and Reeds were traveling alongside, now known as the Boggs Company after its leader Lilburn W. Boggs, reached Fort Laramie. James Reed met James Clyman, an experienced mountaineer who had just arrived from California with Lansford Hastings, using his new route that would later be called Hastings Cutoff. Clyman advised the travelers to avoid Hastings Cutoff and stick to the regular route instead. In July 1846, pivotal events unfolded for the Donner Party as they embarked on their journey westward. The Boggs Company marked Independence Day at Beaver Creek, while another family, the Graves, fell behind at Fort Laramie. This was a momentous occasion, filled with patriotic sentiment, as they celebrated their nation's independence amidst the vast expanse of the American wilderness. As the Boggs Company journeyed on, they reached Independence Rock on July 11th, a notable landmark along their route. Here, they encountered Wales B. Bonney, who delivered a letter from Lansford Hastings, promoting his newly proposed route, Hastings Cutoff. Hastings warned of potential challenges in California and advocated for larger groups for safety. He claimed to have discovered a shorter path via Fort Bridger, south of the Great Salt Lake. Continuing their trek, the company crossed the Continental Divide on July 18th, marking a significant milestone in their journey. By this point, they had traversed 1,000 miles, with over 1,000 miles still ahead. Their progress was both remarkable and daunting, highlighting the immense distance that they still had to cover. At the Little Sandy River on July 19th, the travelers faced a crucial decision. Some opted to follow Hastings' route, forming what would later become known as the Donner Party under the leadership of George Donner. Meanwhile, others chose to stick to the established trail via Fort Hall. This decision would shape their fate in unforeseen ways, setting them on divergent paths toward their shared destination. While the group deliberated, journalist Edwin Bryant cautioned against Hastings Cutoff, citing concerns about its feasibility for wagons. However, his warnings went unheeded, allegedly concealed by Jim Bridger, who had vested interests in promoting the shortcut for personal gain. Despite the advice of those who had traveled the route, including warnings from Bryant and others, the allure of a potentially easier journey via Hastings Cutoff proved too enticing for some members of the party. Ultimately, on July 31st, 1846, the Donner Party departed from Black's Fort, joined by the McCutcheon family and Jean-Baptiste Trudeau. James Reed reported that Hastings Cutoff was believed to save travelers around 350 to 400 miles compared to the longer path. Despite concerns from others about this route, Mr. Bridger assured Reed that it was a good flat road with plenty of water and grass. They estimated it would take about 700 miles to reach Captain Sutter's fort in California, and they hoped to arrive within 7 weeks. Upon reaching the fort, the immigrants welcomed some new members, increasing their group to 74 people. With their numbers bolstered, the Donner Party departed from Fort Bridger and set out on Hastings Cutoff, now 11 days behind the leading group, embarking on a perilous journey into the unknown. The decisions made during this critical period would come to define their arduous and tragic expedition westward. From August 1st to August 5th, the Donner Party initially made promising progress, efficiently following the tracks left by the group led by Hastings. However, when they veered southward to embark on Hastings Cutoff, they encountered terrain significantly more rugged and treacherous than anticipated. The landscape proved to be a formidable obstacle, with steep inclines, forcing wagon drivers to resort to desperate measures, such as locking their wagon wheels to prevent dangerous accidents. Unlike the well-defined and established Oregon Trail, Hastings Cutoff presented a more challenging and less defined path, making navigation considerably more difficult for the party. Despite the assurances from Hastings, the reality of the terrain was much harsher. The party found themselves traversing through unforgiving canyons and facing numerous obstacles, such as boulders blocking their path and dangerously steep descents. This made it apparent that Hastings Cutoff was not the straightforward and manageable route that they had been led to believe. Hastings had left written instructions and messages attached to trees along the trail, intended to guide and assist travelers. However, on August 6th, the party stumbled upon a letter from Hastings advising them to halt their progress until he could personally lead them through the alternate route, different from the one taken by the Harlan Young party. This unexpected development forced the party to reassess their situation and consider their options for the journey ahead. James Reed, Charles T. Stanton, and William Pike ventured ahead in search of Hastings to seek further guidance. However, their journey was fraught with challenges as well, as they encountered impassable canyons and obstacles that hindered their progress. Despite Hastings' initial offer to guide them through the difficult terrain, he provided only partial assistance before turning back, leaving the party to navigate the rugged landscape on their own. Meanwhile, the Graves family, who had embarked on a mission to locate the Donner Party, eventually caught up with them. Their arrival swelled the ranks of the party to 87 members, traveling in 60 to 80 wagons. Back at the main party, Reed blazed a trail to lead them back, with the company opting to follow his route instead of retracing their steps to Fort Bridger. However, progress was slow, with the party advancing at a rate of only about 1.5 miles per day. The men toiled tirelessly, clearing brush, felling trees, and removing rocks to make way for the wagons as they pressed forward through the rugged terrain. By August 20th, the party reached a vantage point in the mountains, offering a breathtaking view of the vast expanse of the Great Salt Lake below. 2 days later, on August 22nd, they descended into Salt Lake Valley via Emigration Canyon, having followed the route provided by East Canyon from the Weber River. Despite their continued progress, they still faced a daunting journey ahead, with approximately 600 miles remaining and only a month of summer left. As the days wore on, tensions within the group began to mount. Stanton and Pike, having accompanied Reed on his journey, became lost on their return to the group, nearly resorting to consuming their horses before eventually being reunited with the party. Tragically, on August 25th, Luke Halloran succumbed to tuberculosis himself, making a solemn moment for the travelers. His burial served as a somber reminder of the harsh realities of their journey and the toll it was taking on their group. As they pressed onward, the party encountered further challenges, including a 2-day journey through barren and inhospitable terrain, as warned by Hastings. They prepared as best they could, gathering water and grass before embarking on the arduous trek. However, the harsh conditions proved relentless, with scorching temperatures during the day and freezing temperatures at night, taking a toll on both the travelers and their resources. By August 30th, the party found themselves facing the most grueling leg of their journey yet. Traversing a 1,000-foot mountain, they emerged to confront a vast, desolate salt flat stretching out before them. The landscape was unforgiving, with the parched earth and scorching sun presenting formidable challenges. The moisture trapped beneath the salt crust seeped upward, transforming the ground into a sticky, adhesive mass. Despite their best efforts, the party's water supply dwindled rapidly, forcing some members to venture ahead on foot in search of additional water resources. The days that followed were fraught with hardship and despair, as the party struggled to navigate the unforgiving terrain. Some of the animals, weakened by exhaustion and thirst, were left behind, while others bolted in a frantic bid for survival. Ultimately, the journey across the Great Salt Lake Desert proved to be a harrowing ordeal, lasting 6 days instead of the anticipated 2. By September 8th, the travelers completed a challenging 5-day journey across the 80-mile desert, which was initially believed to be half its actual width, according to Hastings. Disillusioned by the difficult trek, none of the party members trusted Hastings Cutoff anymore, Upon reaching the springs on the other side, they took time to recuperate. However, their losses were significant. 36 cattle were lost, with half belonging to Reed, and 4 wagons had to be abandoned. The following week was spent at the base of Pilot Peak, recovering from their ordeal, searching for lost cattle, retrieving abandoned wagons, and redistributing the remaining supplies among the surviving wagons. Reed's family suffered the most substantial losses, prompting Reed to take a more assertive role. He requested that all families provide an inventory of their possessions and food. Reed proposed sending 2 men, Charles Stanton and William McCutcheon, to Sutter's Fort in California, as he had heard of Sutter's generosity towards stranded travelers, hoping they could acquire additional provisions. With their livestock exhausted, the remaining serviceable wagons were pulled by mixed teams of cows, oxen, and mules. By mid-September, scouts reported that another 40 miles of desert lay ahead. Despite their worn-out cattle and lean oxen, the Donner Party managed to cross the subsequent desert stretch relatively unharmed. Progress seemed smoother, especially as they traversed the valley near the Ruby Mountains. Although they harbored resentment towards Hastings, they had no alternative but to follow his outdated tracks. On September 26th, 2 months after initially taking Hastings Cut Off, the party rejoined the traditional trail alongside a stream known as the Humboldt River. Interestingly, this standard trail turned out to be 125 miles shorter than Hastings Cut Off, indicating that the shortcut had actually delayed their journey by about a month. While traveling along the Humboldt River, the group encountered Paiute Native Americans, some of whom temporarily joined them. However, these encounters were not without trouble, as some Paiutes allegedly stole or shot several oxen and horses. There were even suspicions that one of Mr. Graves' shirts went missing one night, likely taken by the Paiutes. By mid-October, the Donner families decided to split up in hopes of making faster progress. On October 5th, tensions escalated when the teams led by Reed and Graves got tangled while struggling up a sandy hill at Iron Point, Nevada. A heated altercation ensued between Milt Elliott, Reed's teamster, and John Snyder, who was driving the Graves wagon. Reed intervened with his knife to separate the teams, but Snyder struck him on the head with his whip handle, causing a severe injury. In a desperate act of self-defense, Reed fatally stabbed Snyder under the collarbone. That evening, the witnesses convened to decide the course of action. With American laws not applicable in Mexican territory, where they were at the time, wagon trains often administered their own justice. George Donner, the group's leader, was a day ahead with his family, leaving the main decision to the group. Although some believed Snyder had provoked Reed by hitting him, opinions were divided. Louis Kessberg proposed hanging Reed, but a compromise was reached, allowing Reed to leave the camp alone the next morning, while his family remained under the care of the others. However, Reed's stepdaughter secretly provided him with a rifle and food before his departure. On October 6th, Reed set out westward and caught up with the Donners the following day. One of Reed's teamsters, Walter Heron, opted to accompany him to California. Aware of the dwindling time, the emigrants hastened their journey along the Humboldt River. The challenges endured by the Donner Party led to fragmented groups, each focused on self-preservation and wary of the others. Grass became scarce, and the animals weakened steadily, prompting everyone to walk to lighten the load. Kessberg forced Hardcoop to walk, resulting in severe foot injuries, and he disappeared shortly thereafter. Despite pleas to search for him, the others refused. Native Americans raided Graves' horses, and more cattle were lost due to scarcity of grass and Paiute raids. Nearly 100 oxen and cattle were lost, and food supplies were nearly depleted. The hardships continued as the party reunited with the Donners. Another wagon was abandoned, and the Eddies lost their oxen to Native American attacks, forcing them to abandon their wagons and walk. With rations exhausted, they endured thirst and hunger. Margaret Reed and her children also lost their wagon. However, their ordeal in the desert eventually ended as they reached the Truckee River in lush surroundings. As winter approached, urgency gripped the company to cross the Sierra Nevada before snowfall. Stanton returned with mules and food from Sutter's Fort, with Native American guides providing a glimmer of hope. Despite their bedraggled state, Reed and Herron had made it to safety, and despite the hardships, the party persisted, with the worst seemingly behind them as they faced the daunting Sierra Nevada crossing. Facing the daunting prospect of crossing mountains even more challenging than the Wasatch Range, the Donner Party had to weigh their options, push forward or give their cattle a rest. It was late October, and they had been assured that the pass, now named Donner Pass, wouldn't be blocked by snow until mid-November. On October 28th, James Reed reached Sutter's Fort. Shortly after, tragedy struck when William Foster accidentally shot his brother-in-law, William Pike, during a negligent handling of a loaded gun. Pike passed away, and as he was laid to rest in Truckee Canyon, snow began to fall. Meanwhile, Reed and McCutcheon, after acquiring horses and supplies from Sutter, ventured back into the mountains to reunite with their families. However, they encountered deep snow and were forced to stash their provisions before returning to the fort to await another chance. Meanwhile, the main group resumed their journey, with families progressing one by one. The Breens led the way, followed by the Kesbergs, Stanton with the Reeds, Graves, and Murphys, while the Donners lagged behind. However, an axle on one of the Donner wagons broke, leading George and Jacob Donner to fashion a replacement in the woods. Unfortunately, George injured his hand during the process, slowing their progress further. As November approached, Patrick Breen described their struggle. Pushing forward as fast as their exhausted cattle could manage, they reached the foot of the main ridge near Truckee Lake. Despite clear weather, a halo around the moon hinted at an impending storm. Spending the night by the lake, they awoke to find the summit already blanketed in 5 feet of snow. Though Stanton and a Native American guide reached the pass, they were forced to turn back due to exhaustion. The rest of the group retreated to the eastern end of the lake as a fierce storm enveloped them. Defeated for the time being, they retreated to Truckee Lake, just 150 miles from Sutter's Fort. The Breens, and along with a few others, attempted the steep ascent to Truckee Lake, camping near a cabin built by earlier travelers. The Eddies and Kesbergs joined them, but encountered impassable snowdrifts, forcing a retreat to Truckee Lake. Meanwhile, the Donner families, delayed by the accident, were still several miles behind. With winter closing in, the families prepared for the long haul at Truckee Lake. They took shelter in rough cabins, patched with whatever materials they could find, and endured leaky roofs and the lack of basic amenities. The winter population of 60 included men, women, and children, living in makeshift cabins or tents. Despite their efforts, they faced a harsh reality as an 8-day storm began, signaling the start of a brutal winter ordeal. As the party settled into their camp, they found themselves running low on food supplies, brought back by Stanton from Sutter's Fort. The oxen began perishing, and their frozen carcasses were piled up nearby. While the lake itself hadn't frozen over yet, the pioneers struggled to figure out how to catch lake trout. Despite being the most skilled hunter, Eddie managed to kill a bear, but struggled to find more game. Both the Reed and Eddie families had lost almost everything that they had brought with them. Margaret Reed promised to compensate the Graves and Breen families for their borrowed oxen once they reached California. However, Graves demanded an exorbitant fee of $25 from Eddie for the carcasses of an ox that had already died of starvation. It was plain to see desperation spread throughout the camp, leading some to believe that individuals might fare better crossing the pass alone rather than with the wagons. However, each attempt by small groups ended in failure. A severe storm lasting more than a week buried the area under so much snow that the cattle and horses, which were their only remaining source of food, perished and were now lost in the snow. Patrick Breen began documenting their struggles in a diary on November 20th, initially focusing on the weather conditions, but gradually incorporating references to God and religion into his entries. Here are a few examples. November 20th. Came to this place on the 31st of last month that it snowed. We went on to the pass. The snow so deep we were unable to find the road. Went within 3 miles of the summit, then turned back to the shanty on the lake. We now have killed most of our cattle, having to stay here until next spring and live on poor beef without bread or salt. It snowed during the space of 8 days with little intermission after our arrival here. November 25th. Wind about west-northwest. Cloudy. Looks like the eve of a snowstorm. Our mountaineers intend trying to cross the mountain tomorrow, if the weather is fair. Froze hard last night. November 29th. Still snowing, now about 3 feet deep. Wind west. Killed my last oxen today. We'll skin them tomorrow. Gave another yoke to Foster's. Hard to get wood. December 6th. The morning fine and clear, now some clouds. Wind southeast, not much in the sunshine. Stanton and Graves manufacturing snowshoes for another mountain scrabble. No account of mules. December 20th. Night clear, froze a little, now clear and pleasant. Wind northwest, thawing a little. Mrs. Reed here, no account of milt. Yet Dutch Charlie started for Donner's, turned back, not able to proceed. Tough times, but not discouraged. Our hopes are in God. Amen. Life at Truckee Lake was incredibly tough. The cabins were small and dirty, and the heavy snowfall kept everyone indoors for days on end. Their diets quickly became limited to whatever they could scrounge up. They boiled strips of oxhide to make a gel-like substance that tasted terrible. Bones from oxen and horses were boiled over and over to make soup, but they became so fragile that they would break apart when chewed. Sometimes, they resorted to charring the bones to make them edible. The Murphy children even resorted to tearing apart the oxhide rug by the fireplace, roasting it over the open flames, and eating it. After the group with snowshoes left, nearly 2/3 of the people at Truckee Lake were children. Mrs. Graves looked after 8 of them, while Levina Murphy and Eleanor Eddy took care of 9. Some of the migrants caught and ate mice that wandered into their cabins out of desperation. Many became weak and spent most of their time in bed. Occasionally, someone would make the arduous journey to visit the Donners. However, news soon arrived that Jacob Donner and 3 hired men had died. One of the men, Joseph Reinhardt, confessed on his deathbed to murdering another member of the group named Wolfinger. To add to their troubles, George Donner's hand became infected, leaving only 4 men able to work at the Donner camp. Margaret Reed managed to save enough food to make a pot of soup for Christmas, which brought some joy to her children. However, by January, they were facing starvation. They even considered eating the oxhides that served as their roof. Margaret, her daughter Virginia, Milt Elliott, and a servant girl named Eliza Williams attempted to walk out to find food. After 4 days in the snow, they had to turn back. Their cabin was no longer livable, so they moved in with the Breens. The servants went to live with other families. And one day, the Graves family came to collect a debt owed by the Reeds and took the oxhides, leaving the family with nothing to eat. By all accounts, the darkest part of night had arrived. Or so they thought. The group stranded at Truckee Lake faced increasing difficulties. 2 members, Augustus Spitzer and Bayless Williams, passed away due to severe malnutrition rather than outright starvation. Franklin Graves then took the initiative to craft 14 pairs of makeshift snowshoes using ox bows and hide. Something had to be done. So on December 16th, a desperate party of 17 individuals, including men, women, and children, embarked on foot to cross the mountain pass. Remarkably, 4 of the men were fathers, while 3 mothers entrusted their young children to other women. Carrying only 6 days' worth of food, along with basic supplies like a rifle, blanket, hatchet, and pistols, they aimed to reach Bear Valley. Historian Charles McGlashan later dubbed this brave yet desperate group the Forlorn Hope. During their journey, 2 members without snowshoes, Charles Berger and 10-year-old William Murphy, turned back early on. Others in the party improvised a pair of snowshoes for 12-year-old Lemuel Murphy on the first night, using one of the pack saddles they carried. Though the snowshoes helped, they faced numerous challenges in the harsh conditions. Lacking proper nourishment and experience with deep snow, most members were afflicted with snow blindness by the 3rd day. On the 6th day, a fortunate discovery was made when Eddie found his wife had a small hidden amount of bear meat in his pack. Pressing onward on December 21st, one member, Stanton, fell behind and was later found deceased in the same spot the following year. As they trudged on, the group became disoriented and disheartened. With food supplies depleted and desperation setting in, Patrick Dolan suggested a morbid solution. One member should volunteer to sacrifice themselves in order to feed the others. While some proposed a duel, others considered a lottery to select the unfortunate individual. Patrick Dolan himself lost the draw, but the group couldn't bring themselves to go through with it. At night, a blizzard extinguished their fire, forcing them to huddle together under the blankets in what would later be known as the Camp of Death. Despite William Eddy's suggestion to keep moving until exhaustion took its toll, a fierce blizzard compelled them to halt their progress. Tragically, the first casualties were Antonio, the animal handler, followed by Franklin Graves. As the blizzard intensified, Dolan's sanity slipped away. He tore off his clothes and dashed into the woods, claiming it was as warm as a summer day. Shortly after his return, he passed away. Struggling with hunger and the nearness of death, some members of the group resorted to consuming flesh from Dolan's body. Meanwhile, young Lemuel Murphy succumbed to starvation. Desperate attempts were made by Lemuel's sister to feed him, but he passed away shortly thereafter. Despite their dire situation, Eddie, Salvador, and Luis refused to partake in such gruesome acts. The following day, recognizing the harsh reality of their circumstances, the remaining survivors made the difficult decision to harvest flesh from the deceased to preserve for future sustenance. They took great care to ensure that no one would have to consume the flesh of their own kin. After a brief period of rest, they resumed their journey, hoping to find the trail. However, hunger continued to gnaw at them, eventually leading Eddie to reluctantly consume human flesh. But their meager supplies soon ran out. In a desperate bid to survive, they disassembled their snowshoes, using the oxhide webbing as food. The conversation turned grim as they discussed the possibility of killing Luis and Salvador for sustenance. Sensing the danger, the 2 men silently departed. Tragedy struck again as Jay Fosdick passed away during the night, leaving only 7 survivors. Eddie and Mary Graves ventured out to hunt, but upon their return with deer meat, they discovered that Fosdick's body had already been dismembered for food. After enduring several more days, 25 in total since their departure from Truckee Lake, the Forlorn Hope encountered Salvador and Luis, who had gone without food for about 9 days and were on the brink of death themselves. William Foster, having harbored intentions since before their departure, shot both men. Their bodies were then dismembered and their flesh preserved for sustenance. While the act of killing the two young men was not kept secret, Foster faced minimal repercussions and lived out the remainder of his life without legal consequences. This can be attributed to the prevailing sentiment, as articulated by historians, that the lives of Native Americans were often undervalued. Only a few days later, the group stumbled upon a Native American settlement, appearing so emaciated and worn that the inhabitants initially fled in fear. However, the Native Americans eventually provided what little sustenance they could offer: acorns, grass, and pine nuts. And after spending a few days there, Eddie pressed on with the assistance of tribe members, eventually reaching a ranch in a small farming community on the outskirts of the Sacramento Valley. A hastily organized rescue party located the other 6 survivors on January 17th. Their arduous journey from Truckee Lake had spanned 33 days in total. In late October of 1846, James Reed successfully made his way out of the Sierra Nevada and reached Rancho Johnson. While he was safe and recovering at Sutter's Fort, his concern for the fate of his family and friends grew with each passing day. Reed urgently appealed to Colonel John C. Fremont, requesting assistance and assembling a team to cross the pass and aid the stranded party. In exchange for this assistance, Reed pledged to join Fremont's forces and participate in the Mexican-American War. Accompanying Reed was McCutcheon, who had been unable to return with Stanton, along with several members of the Harlan Young Party. The Harlan Young wagon train, consisting of approximately 30 horses and a dozen men, had arrived at Sutter's Fort on October 8th, marking the last successful passage over the Sierra Nevada for the season. Laden with food supplies, they anticipated encountering the Donner Party on the western side of the mountain, near the Bear River, albeit in dire straits. However, upon reaching the river valley, they discovered only a pioneer couple who had become separated from their company and were on the brink of starvation. Despite facing desertion by 2 guides who absconded with some of their horses, Reed and McCutcheon persisted, venturing further up the valley to Yuba Bottoms, ultimately covering the last mile on foot. Standing at the base of Emigrant Gap, a mere 12 miles from the summit, they were confronted with an impassable barrier of snow. Their hopes dashed, Reed and McCutcheon reluctantly retraced their steps to Sutter's Fort, their rescue mission unfulfilled. During the Mexican-American War, much of the military force in California was occupied, leaving few able-bodied men available for other tasks. For instance, Fremont's personnel were busy capturing Santa Barbara during the same period. This war effort resulted in blocked roads, disrupted communication, and a shortage of supplies across the region. Despite calls for volunteers to aid the Donner Party, only 3 men responded initially. James Reed found himself delayed in San Jose until February due to local uprisings and widespread confusion. During this time, he engaged in discussions with fellow pioneers and acquaintances. And in response to the dire situation, the people of San Jose drafted a petition urging the United States Navy to intervene and assist the stranded individuals back at Truckee Lake. Reports circulated in 2 local newspapers regarding members of the Snowshoe Party resorting to cannibalism, which stirred sympathy for those still trapped in the mountains. Motivated by compassion, residents of Yerba Buena, many of whom were recent migrants themselves, raised $1,300 in organized relief efforts. These funds were used to establish 2 camps aimed at providing support for a rescue mission to aid the stranded refugees. On February 4th, a team led by William Eddy set out from the Sacramento Valley to rescue the stranded Donner Party. They faced challenges like rain and a swollen river, causing some delays. While Eddy stayed at Bear Valley, others in the group pushed through snowstorms to reach Truckee Lake, storing food along the way to lighten their load. Although 3 members turned back, 7 persevered. By February 18th, the 7-man team reached Fremont Pass, now known as Donner Pass. As they approached where Eddie had directed them to find the cabins, they shouted out. A weary Mrs. Murphy emerged from a snow-covered shelter, questioning if they were Californians or angels. The rescuers rationed out food cautiously, fearing that too much could harm the starving migrants. All the cabins were buried under snow, with their oxide roofs decaying and emitting a foul odor. 13 individuals had passed away at the camps, and they were laid to rest in the snow near the cabin roofs. Some of the survivors appeared to be struggling emotionally. A trio from the rescue team journeyed to the Donner family's location and escorted back 4 emaciated children and 3 adults. Leanna Donner faced significant challenges climbing from Alder Creek to Truckee Lake, describing the ordeal as indescribably painful, filled with suffering. George Donner's arm was severely infected still, rendering him immobile. From the group, 23 individuals were selected to accompany the rescue team, leaving 21 at Truckee Lake and 12 at Alder Creek. The rescuers kept the truth about the snowshoe party's fate hidden, informing the survivors only that they hadn't returned due to frostbite. Patty and Tommy Reed grew too weak to traverse the snowdrifts, and no one was strong enough to carry them. Margaret Reed confronted a heart-wrenching decision. She accompanied her 2 older children to Bear Valley, while her 2 frail children remained at Truckee Lake. Before parting ways, Patty told her mother, "If you never see me again, do the best you can." Upon their return to the lake, the Breens initially refused them shelter, but after Glover left additional provisions, they reluctantly allowed the children inside. The rescue team, meanwhile, was disheartened to discover that animals had raided the first food cache, leaving them without provisions for 4 days. During the challenging journey over the pass, John Denton slipped into a coma and passed away. Shortly after, Ada Kessberg also succumbed, leaving her mother devastated and unwilling to part with her child's body. As the rescuers continued through rough terrain for several more days, they grew increasingly worried about the children's survival. Some of the children resorted to eating the buckskin fringe from one rescuer's pants and the shoelaces from another, much to the surprise of the relief party. On their descent from the mountains, they encountered the next group of rescuers, including James Reed. Margaret, upon hearing Reed's voice, collapsed into the snow, overwhelmed with emotion. Once the rescued migrants safely reached Bear Valley, tragedy struck when William Hook, Jacob Donner's stepson, broke into the food stores and overindulged, resulting in his death. The remaining survivors continued on to Sutter's Fort, where Virginia Reed expressed feeling as though she had entered paradise. She found amusement in the fact that one young man proposed marriage to her, despite her being only 13 years old and recovering from starvation, though she did decline his offer. At the time when the initial rescue mission was being arranged, George C. Yunt, a nearby California settler, experienced troubling dreams about a group of starving pioneers struggling in deep snow. So upon hearing this, Yunt, along with Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo and others, gathered $500 to fund another rescue effort. On March 1st, the second rescue team reached Truckee Lake. Among them were seasoned mountain men, notably John Turner, who accompanied Reed and McCutcheon on their return. Reed was joyously reunited with his daughter Patty and his ailing son Tommy. Upon inspection, the Breen cabin appeared relatively well, but the condition of the Murphy cabin, as described by author George R. Stewart, was beyond description and almost beyond belief. Lavina Murphy, caring for her 8-year-old son Simon and the 2 young children of William Eddy and Foster, was mentally deteriorating and nearly blind. The children were lethargic and neglected, having gone days without proper care. Louis Kessberg, with an injured leg, could barely move and had taken up residence in the cabin. During the period between the departure of the first rescue party and the arrival of the second, no one at Truckee Lake had died. However, Patrick Breen recounted a disturbing visit in late February from Mrs. Murphy, who mentioned that her family was considering resorting to cannibalism involving Milt Elliott. Reed and McCutcheon later discovered Elliott's mutilated body. At the Alder Creek camp, the situation was equally grim. The first two members of the relief party to arrive witnessed Trudeau carrying a human leg. Upon being discovered, he disposed of it in a hole in the snow, alongside the mostly dismembered remains of Jacob Donner. Inside one tent, Elizabeth Donner refused to eat, while her children were being sustained by their father's organs. 3 other bodies had already been consumed. In the other tent, Tamsen Donner appeared to be in relatively good health, but George was severely ill due to an infection that had spread to his shoulder. The second rescue mission successfully evacuated 17 individuals from Truckee Lake, with only 3 of them being adults. Both the Breen and Graves families decided to leave. At Truckee Lake, only 5 people remained: Kesberg, Mrs. Murphy and her son Simon, along with the young Eddie and foster children. Tamsen Donner chose to stay with her sick husband after Reed assured her that a third rescue team was on its way. Mrs. Donner opted to keep her daughters, Eliza, Georgia, and Frances, with her. The journey back to Bear Valley progressed slowly for the second rescue team. At one point, Reed sent 2 men ahead to retrieve the first batch of stored food, anticipating the arrival of the third rescue party led by a man named Mr. Woodworth. However, a fierce blizzard struck after they crossed the pass. Tragically, 5-year-old Isaac Donner froze to death, and Reed himself nearly met the same fate. Mary Donner suffered severe burns on her feet because they were so frostbitten that she didn't realize that she was resting them in the fire while sleeping. When the storm subsided, the Breen and Graves family were too drained and weary to move, having gone without food for days. Consequently, the rescue party had to leave without them. The location where the Breens and Graves were left became known as Starved Camp. Margaret Breen reportedly took charge in trying to sustain the camp members after the others departed down the mountain. Despite her efforts, Elizabeth Graves and her son Franklin succumbed to death before the arrival of the next rescue team, leading the remaining members to consume the flesh of the deceased in order to live even one more day. 3 members of the rescue team stayed behind to assist those still at the camps: Charles Stone at Truckee Lake and Charles Cady and Nicholas Clark at Alder Creek. While Clark was out hunting, Stone journeyed to Alder Creek and coordinated with Cady to return to California. According to Stewart, Tamsen Donner arranged for them to take her daughters Eliza, Georgia, and Frances with them, possibly for $500 in cash. Stone and Cady escorted the 3 girls to Truckee Lake, but left them at a cabin with Kesberg and Lavina Murphy when they set off for Bear Valley. Cady later recalled that after 2 days on the trail, they noticed and passed Starved Camp, but they didn't stop to offer assistance. Instead, they caught up with Reed and the others within a few days. Several days later, at the Alder Creek camp, Clark and Trudeau decided to journey to California together. And upon reaching Truckee Lake and finding the Donner girls still there, they returned to Alder Creek to inform Tamsen Donner, the girls' mother. William Foster and William Eddy, survivors of the snowshoe party, departed from Bear Valley to intercept Reed, accompanied by a man named John Stark. After a day, they encountered Reed helping his children struggle toward Bear Valley, frostbitten and bleeding, but alive. Driven by the desperate need to rescue their own children, Foster and Eddy convinced 4 men, through persuasion and financial incentives, to accompany them back to Truckee Lake. During their journey, they stumbled upon the 11 survivors at Starved Camp, gathered around a fire that had sunk into a pit. The rescue team then split up, with Foster, Eddy, and 2 others heading back toward Truckee Lake. 2 of the rescuers, hoping to save some of the Starved Camp survivors, each took a child and headed back to Bear Valley. However, John Stark refused to leave the others. He picked up 2 children along with all the provisions and aided the remaining Breves and Graves to safety, sometimes carrying the children in stages along the trail, setting them down, and then returning to retrieve the other weakened children. Foster and Eddie, meanwhile, reached Truckee Lake on March 14th, where they tragically discovered that their children had perished. Kesberg informed Eddie that he had consumed the remains of Eddie's son, prompting Eddie to vow revenge on Kesberg if they ever crossed paths in California. Meanwhile, George Donner and one of Jacob Donner's children were still alive at Alder Creek. Tamsen Donner had just returned to the Murphy cabin to attend to her daughters. Despite being informed that another rescue party was unlikely to arrive soon, Tamsen chose to stay with her husband. Foster, Eddie, and the others from the 3rd rescue party departed with the Donner girls, young Simon Murphy, Trudeau, and Clark. Lavina Murphy was too weak to leave, and Kesberg refused to accompany them. 2 additional rescue parties were assembled to save any surviving adults. However, both turned back before reaching Bear Valley, and no further attempts were made. On April 10th, nearly a month after the 3rd relief had departed from Truckee Lake, the local official near Sutter's Fort organized a team to salvage what they could of the Donners' belongings. The proceeds from the sale of these items would be used to support the orphaned Donner children. The salvage team found the Alder Creek tents deserted except for George Donner's body, who had passed away just days earlier. During their return journey to Truckee Lake, the salvage team stumbled upon Louis Kesberg, who was miraculously still alive. According to Kesberg, Mrs. Murphy had passed away a week after the 3rd relief party's departure. He claimed that Tamsen Donner had sought refuge in his cabin weeks later, but had tragically died overnight. However, the salvage team became suspicious when they discovered a pot containing human flesh in Kesberg's cabin, along with George Donner's belongings, including his pistols, jewelry, and $250 in gold. Threatened with lynching, Kesberg confessed that at Tamsen's suggestion, he had hidden $273 of the Donner's money to benefit her children in the future. The complete story of what truly happened to the Donner Reed party was only just beginning to be written. Word of the Donner Party's tragic fate began to spread eastward thanks to Samuel Brannan, a journalist and leader in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who encountered the salvage team as they were descending the mountain pass with Kesberg. Reports of the ordeal reached New York City by July 1847. The coverage of the event across the United States was heavily influenced by the widespread enthusiasm for westward expansion. While some newspapers mentioned the tragedy briefly, many sensationalized the story. Several newspapers, including those in California, described the cannibalism in graphic and exaggerated detail. Some reports portrayed the members of the Donner Party as courageous heroes and depicted California as a land worth significant sacrifices. Following the Donner Party incident, there was a decline in the number of people migrating westward, but this decrease was likely more due to concerns about the ongoing Mexican-American War than the cautionary tale of the Donner Party. In 1846, approximately 1,500 individuals migrated to California. This number decreased to 450 in 1847, and further to 400 in 1848. However, the California gold rush sparked a significant surge in migration, with 25,000 people heading west in 1849. Most of these migrants traveled along the Carson River, although some 49ers followed the same route as the Donner Party, leaving behind records and descriptions of the area. In late June 1847, members of the Mormon Battalion, led by General Stephen W. Kearny, buried the human remains and partially burned 2 of the cabins left behind by the Donner Party. Over the following years, only a few individuals dared to journey over the pass, where they discovered bones, various items, and the cabin once occupied by the Reed and Graves families. In 1891, a stash of money was unearthed near the lake, likely hidden by Mrs. Graves in haste as she departed with the second relief party and intended to retrieve it later. Lansford Hastings, who played a role in the disaster by suggesting a risky shortcut, faced death threats as a consequence. One migrant who had crossed the area before the Donner Party encountered Hastings and confronted him about the hardships they had endured, to which Hastings could only express regret and claim good intentions. Most historians agree there were 87 members in the Donner Party, although some include Sarah Keyes, Margaret Reed's mother, as well as Luis and Salvador, which would bring the total to 90. 5 of these individuals died before reaching Truckee Lake, due to various reasons such as illness, accidents, and exposure to the cold. Between December 1846 and April 1847, an additional 34 members perished, with more men than women among the deceased. Researchers have analyzed these deaths to understand the factors influencing survival in such harsh conditions. The fatalities at Truckee Lake, Alder Creek, and among the Snowshoe Party were likely due to a combination of factors, including prolonged malnutrition, strenuous labor, and exposure to the elements. Starvation made individuals more susceptible to infections, which contributed to deaths, like in the case of George Donner. However, age, gender, and family size played the most significant roles in determining who survived. Survivors tended to be younger, with children between 6 and 14 having higher chances of survival compared to infants and adults over 35. None of the individuals over 49 years old survived, and mortality rates were particularly high among men aged 20 to 39. Biological differences between men and women also influenced survival rates. Men metabolized protein faster and were often assigned more physically demanding tasks, which left them more vulnerable to starvation and exhaustion. Conversely, women's bodies store more fat, providing a buffer against starvation and physical decline. Traveling with family members increased the likelihood of survival, as families shared resources and supported each other during the ordeal. Out of the 87 individuals who entered the Wasatch Mountains, only 48 managed to survive the Donner Party incident. Among the survivors, only the Reed and Breen families remained whole, while the children of Jacob Donner, George Donner, and Franklin Graves were left without parents. William Eddy found himself alone after most of the Murphy family perished, and only 3 mules made it to California, with the rest of the animals dying along the way. Many of the belongings of the Donner Party were left behind or discarded. Some of the widowed men remarried shortly after the tragedy, as eligible partners were scarce in California at the time. The Reeds settled in San Jose, where 2 of the Donner children also lived with them. James Reed found success during the California Gold Rush and became prosperous. Virginia Reed penned a detailed letter to her cousin in Illinois, recounting the challenges faced during their journey to California, with her father providing some editorial input. Journalist Edwin Bryant carried the letter back to Illinois in June 1847, and it was published in the Illinois Journal on December 16, 1847, albeit with some modifications made by the editors. Additionally, Virginia fulfilled a personal vow by converting to Catholicism, a decision she made while witnessing Patrick Breen's devout prayers in his cabin. The Murphy survivors found their new home in Marysville, California. Meanwhile, the Breens settled in San Juan Bautista. In 1848, the Breen family acquired the Castro Adobe with funds earned by 16-year-old John Breen in California's gold country. They transformed the adobe into an inn. Their story became the focus of J. Ross Brown's article in Harper's Magazine in 1862, where he expressed discomfort upon realizing he was lodging with individuals rumored to have resorted to cannibalism during the Donner Party incident. Similar reactions greeted many other survivors. The youngest member of the Breen family Isabella, was only 1 year old during the harsh winter of 1846 to 47. She ultimately became the last surviving member of the Donner Party, passing away in San Francisco on March 25, 1935. Following the tragedy, the children of George and Tamsen Donner were taken in by an elderly couple near Sutter's Fort. Eliza, who was merely 3 years old during the fateful winter, was the youngest among the Donner children. In 1911, she authored an account of the Donner Party based on printed records and the recollections of her sisters. The Graves children pursued diverse paths in life following the Donner Party tragedy. Mary Graves married early, but her first husband met a tragic fate himself. He was murdered. And remarkably, Mary took on the solemn duty of preparing meals for her husband's killer while he awaited his execution in prison, ensuring he didn't go hungry before facing his punishment. Reflecting on her experiences, one of Mary's grandchildren recalled her as a solemn figure, unable to shed tears, even when she wished she could. Her brother William led a varied life, engaging in several occupations and living a multifaceted lifestyle. Described by his nieces as eccentric and easily irritated, William passed away in 1907 and was laid to rest in Calistoga. Nancy Graves, who was just 9 years old during the tragic winter, refused to acknowledge her involvement in the Donner Party incident, even when approached by historians seeking to document accurate accounts of the events. It's said that Nancy struggled to come to terms with her part in the cannibalism that claimed the lives of her mother and her own brother. William Eddy remarried and established a family in California. Despite his initial intention to carry out his vow to exact revenge on Lewis Kessberg, he was persuaded otherwise by James Reed and Edwin Bryant. A year later, William Eddy recounted his harrowing experiences to J. Quinn Thornton, who penned one of the earliest written narratives of the Donner Party tragedy. Thornton also drew from James Reed's recollections. Eddy passed away in Petaluma on December 24, 1859. Lewis Kessberg, meanwhile, took legal action against several members of the Relief Party who accused him of killing Tamsen Donner. The court ruled in Kessberg's favor, awarding him a symbolic $1 in damages, but he was also ordered to cover the court expenses. An 1847 article published in the California Star depicted Kessberg's actions in a gruesome light, detailing a near lynching incident by the salvage party. It alleged that Kessberg showed a preference for consuming human flesh over the cattle and horses exposed during the spring thaw. Historian Charles McGlashan collected substantial evidence that seemed to implicate Kessberg in Tamsen Donner's death, but after conducting an interview with him, McGlashan concluded that no murder had occurred. Eliza Donner also maintained Kessberg's innocence. Regardless, as Kessberg aged, he became increasingly reclusive, shunned by society, and frequently threatened. Unfortunately, life after the Donner Party tragedy, for the survivors, wasn't all it was cracked up to be. While some survivors of the Donner Party incident contested the reports of cannibalism, the aforementioned Charles McGlashan, who corresponded with many survivors over 4 decades, collected numerous accounts confirming its occurrence. Some survivors initially hesitated to discuss their involvement due to shame, but eventually opened up about it. In his 1879 book, History of the Donner Party, McGlashan chose not to include certain distressing details, like the suffering of children before death, or Mrs. Murphy's resignation when the last children left in the third rescue effort. He also omitted any mention of cannibalism at Alder Creek. However, in a letter to McGlashan, Georgia Donner clarified that human flesh was indeed prepared and served in both tents at Alder Creek, but it was primarily given to the youngest children. She recalled her father crying during this time. Elizabeth Donner, Jacob's wife, reportedly announced one morning that she had cooked the arm of Samuel Shoemaker a 25-year-old teamster. Eliza Donner's 1911 account of the ordeal did not reference cannibalism at Alder Creek. Evidence from archaeological excavations at the Alder Creek camp also did not definitively confirm cannibalism. None of the bones found at the cooking area could be positively identified as human. According to Rarick, only cooked bones would have survived, and it is unlikely that the Donner Party members would have had to cook human bones. Eliza Farnham's 1856 retelling of the Donner Party's ordeal relied heavily on an interview with Margaret Breen. In her narrative, Farnham describes the challenges faced by the Graves and Breen families after James Reed and the Second Relief Team left them stranded in the snow. According to Farnham's version, 7-year-old Mary Donner proposed that they consume Isaac Donner, Franklin Graves Jr., and Elizabeth Graves, as the Donner family had already resorted to cannibalism at Alder Creek, including Mary's father Jacob. Margaret Breen adamantly denied that she and her family partook in cannibalism, but scholars like Kristen Johnson, Ethan Rarick, and Joseph King, whose account sympathizes with the Breen family, question the credibility of this denial. They argue that considering the Breens had gone without food for 9 days, it seems improbable that they could have survived without consuming human flesh. King speculates that Farnham included this detail in her narrative independently of Margaret Breen's testimony. In 1847, H.A. Wise published an account where Trudeau claimed heroic acts, but also confessed to eating Jacob Donner and even a baby raw in disturbing detail. Many years later, Trudeau denied cannibalism when he met Eliza Donner, one of the few survivors. He repeated this denial in an interview with a St. Louis newspaper in 1891 when he was 60 years old. Despite their difficult circumstances, and Trudeau eventually leaving Tamsin Donner alone, Eliza and the other Donner children held affection for Trudeau, and he for them. Author George Stewart believed Trudeau's story to Wise was more truthful than what he told to Eliza in 1884, suggesting that he had deserted the Donner family. Conversely, Kristen Johnson suggested that Trudeau's interview with Wise might have been a result of seeking attention and shocking his elders, typical behavior for adolescents. Later in life, he may have altered his story to avoid upsetting Eliza. Historians Joseph King and Jack Steed criticized Stewart's portrayal of Trudeau's actions as desertion, labeling it as exaggerated moral judgment, especially since all members of the party faced tough decisions. Ethan Rarick supported this view, emphasizing that the Donner Party's story is more about the difficult decisions made under extreme circumstances than about heroism or villainy. The Donner Party incident remains a topic of interest due to the reliable records detailing the events, as stated by Stewart. Although cannibalism is often highlighted, it's just one part of the story that captures people's attentions due to its taboo nature. This incident focuses on ordinary families rather than extraordinary individuals, which adds to its appeal, according to Johnson. It's a tragic irony that many who sought a better life in California found only suffering and death instead of prosperity and health. The site where the cabin stood became a tourist attraction as early as 1854, and by the 1880s, Charles McGlashan advocated for a monument to honor the Donner Party's memory. He played a key role in obtaining the land for the monument. In June 1918, a statue depicting a pioneer family dedicated to the Donner Party was erected at the location believed to be the site of the Breen-Kesburg cabin. The spot was designated as a California Historical Landmark in 1934. In 1927, the state of California founded the Donner Memorial State Park, initially covering 11 acres around the monument. 2 decades later, they acquired the Murphy Cabin site, expanding the park. And in 1962, the Emigrant Trail Museum was built to showcase the history of people migrating to California. The Murphy Cabin and Donner Monument gained National Historic Landmark status in 1963. A large rock, once part of the fireplace in Murphy's cabin, now features a bronze plaque listing the Donner Party members and their fates. California sees fit to honor this site because it represents a significant event in American history, transformed into a well-known tale. As of the new millennia, the park attracts around 200,000 visitors annually. And for a good reason too. Without the artifacts and detailed records standing the test of time, America and the world at large may not have ever known about the Donner Party incident. Undoubtedly, one of the most terrifying and gruesome ordeals in Old West history. It's not mythology, it's not folklore, it's not a fable or frontier fairy tale. It's the truth, albeit a horrifying piece of it.